Hello and welcome to this edition of V Radio. If this is your first time tuning into V Radio, you can check out my archives either on my YouTube channel or on my podcast, which is generally available through Apple Podcasts, several other mediums. I will actually link ways that you can find them both on the description for this show. Today, my guest is a man named Paul Rossi. Paul Rossi is a teacher who is essentially, I guess, kind of a whistleblower when it comes to the issues of critical race theory and anti-racism being taught in public schools. I know that he's had some exposure with some of the major, like he had an interview with Jordan Peterson and an interview with Benjamin Boyce, and now I've got the privilege of being able to bring him here to V Radio. Welcome, Paul, to the show.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
So my first question generally is, what made you decide to become an activist? Like, what was the precipice moment? And I think for you, it would kind of be from when you decided, like, I'm a teacher, but now I think I'm going to have to be an activist teacher.
It was a very slow, gradual process. Our school, which is a private school, started to make a commitment to what is called anti-racism in 2015. And it was a top-down decision by the board. And it was made very clear to the faculty and staff at the beginning of the year in 2016 that this was non-negotiable, and we would all have to get on board with a whole host of essentially premises about the way society is rigged and our responsibility as activist teachers to promote this. And I had concerns at the time, before I even actually started to see any of the implementation, that just framing the problem in terms of anti-racism, when racism has undergone a tremendous amount of concept creep, even at that point, meant that we were potentially going to risk going, as a school community, creating an atmosphere where there could be kind of a witch hunt situation,
Right.
Since people define racism differently, right? So what does it mean to be anti-racist? Some people, even at that time, the American flag was racist. So is that going to constitute, to be anti-racist, should we be anti the American flag? And I raised these concerns with the administration, and they told me, they kind of poo-pooed me, and they said, oh, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. It's a work in progress. We're going to be bringing in, you'll have a chance, an opportunity to work with us. And within a year or two, it became clear that several of the members in the school community and the administration level, as well as many of my colleagues, were, the process was underway to gradually ratchet up the rolling this out to the curriculum, having teacher trainings, having professional development around, this mindset. And so when I realized, at a certain point, I think it was maybe 2017, 18, that, this was going somewhere that I was definitely not happy with. And I was going, and I could feel a real separation mentally between my own reservations and my ability to express those in the community. And so I became kind of, not an activist, but definitely somebody that was starting to document and work in small ways against what was going on.
Now, a real quick clarification, because I just listened to some of your talk with Jordan Peterson. You guys are talking about this going on like back in 2015, right? I mean, like, I guess it started a lot earlier than I had originally expected.
That's right. We are a new, relatively new high school in New York City, and New York City, and particularly Manhattan, is a very sort of elite kind of liberal bubble to begin with. And so I think we were sort of a precursor to a lot of things that rolled out to other private schools and public schools. I mean, as early as 2012, we were working with an organization called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which is, the person who started that is, directly connected with Saul Alinsky. So, we were, I guess, on the forefront of this wave that as it started to roll out. So.
Right. And I think that's part of the most insidious issue is that I think some people don't really realize how long this has been going on, even just in this manifestation of it. I pointed out to some of my listeners earlier that you can watch I wouldn't call it a documentary, it's more of a presentation that a KGB Soviet defector had put out back in the 80s. You can find it on
Mm-hmm.
YouTube. I'll probably provide a link to it here, but he was talking about ideological subversion. And one of the major steps of it was this idea of kind of infiltrating the education system, and getting people strategically placed.
Mm-hmm.
And that part about it, I mean, everybody just kind of assumes, well, nothing really crazy is going to go through, right? I mean, everything's still rational. And Christina Hoff Sommers, she also described this when it came to feminist ideas, but basically, it started in the colleges where the people who were the activists in the 60s all kind of get together and say, well, we're going to become professors. And then after they get tenure, they start writing textbooks. And then you start realizing, oh, so now this crap is being taught not as an opinion. This stuff
Mm-hmm.
is just being taught as a fact. And with that, I mean, was that kind of an experience have you seen any of that taking place in the colleges or?
Oh yeah, it was happening, in the '80s, late '80s and early '90s when I was undergrad, and at that time, there was already, there was a sort of a wave of political correctness, they called it, and there was a book actually called Tenured Radicals about exactly the phenomenon of the sort of children of the revolutions of the '60s coming into positions of power in the academy, and you're correct. What's happened in the decades after that is that those from those positions, now we have the children of the revolution who the phenomenon is now metastasized, and we have people in positions of power in all the major institutions, particularly education, which is why we're seeing education is sort of the main battlefield right now for a lot of these issues, K through 12.
Well, and I think
But it's
that
also in
people,
HR, it's in the media, it's in the government, it's everywhere.
right. Well, yeah, and the media has changed dramatically too. I mean, there was a time when the media was competing to get the most accurate information out there. And now both sides, the right and the left sides of the media, have just become like political theater, catering to certain audiences. That's actually part of the reason why I dusted off my headset and started doing this again, because it was driving me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
You can't watch the news anywhere, because both sides of it are just so crazy. And it's even infiltrated some of the YouTube stuff, like the Young Turks has basically become a Fox News for progressives. They they clearly got somebody writing notes to them about what they're supposed to put out, but I don't want to get too far off the topic. The main point is just that this has been going on longer than people think, and I think that we have become complacent in the idea that perhaps we thought this could never happen here. And I would say that the people who are orchestrating this, that's exactly what they were counting on. I mean, in my local town, it's a very conservative place. And I think the only reason it's gotten as far as it had so far was just that nobody knew about it. I don't think people don't really necessarily pay attention to their school board elections. They don't pay attention necessarily to who their superintendent is unless there's a real reason for them to talk to them. So these meetings are all going on, and most of them are still public, like as in forced to be public, but people just don't show up, like unless they, like they're PTA types, they're not even going to go. So that's actually one of the things that led me to talk to you was that slide that I showed you that was basically kind of explaining how apparently white children and only white children, because they clarify that supposedly kids of color do not do this, prefer other white children, like going all the way back to being babies.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed that to you, and you said you were familiar with it and you've seen it used before. What are your views on that slide?
Well, it's a great example of the general approach that a lot of this, I guess it's just propaganda. The way it works is that it creates a sort of there's first of all it's kind of a lot of ideal laundered scholarship, and I haven't looked at these particular studies, and I would be very interested in following up and looking at them. But the main idea is that race is a social construction, but that since we are all tabula rasa because of, the way that we're born, thrown into society, that we are so deeply affected by our environment, since that is the force which makes us who we are, that we are all racialized since birth to, from birth to the age of 6, which is what this slide is showing. And,
right.
but there's so many places that the other possible explanations for some of the experimental results are elided. For example, some of the recognition may just be not due to race, but, some of the experimental results may be due to just differences. If a person is, raised in a family or in a community where people look a certain way, if you could make it not racial, but different in other ways, and they might give the same experimental results. So there are sort of possible conflations of things depending on the way the experiment is conducted, the sample size. Are these things qualitative, quantitative? And it's all agenda driven. So there has been a lot of work done on ideal laundering in the social sciences and the replicability crisis and all of these other things. And so these essentially become activist scholarship at this, and so the point is to justify, is to create a set of premises that justify the intervention, the anti-racist intervention. So a slide like this, which is showing that, our kids are racist anyway, is all set up to heighten the necessity for them to come in and preach, to preach to your kids how to fix it.
Right. Well, and the thing is like, just my own studies of social sciences, if somebody had said to me perhaps that all babies to some extent like prefer other babies that look like themselves, that would almost kind of make sense. Like I could go, okay, well, maybe there's a reason for that. I imagine like if we set a kitten down and it could either go to a cat or a dog, it would probably go to the cat, But it's when it says, but like if you put in like parentheses, but only white children have this effect. And I'm like, that's when I meant, no, I'm sorry. And to break down what you're talking about a little bit easier for some of my audience, as far as that, particularly, I've talked about this in some of my other episodes, but the grievance studies affair, when 3 activists who are also professors, if I remember, they're all professors, but, basically put together fake studies and submitted them to scientific journals to see if they could get them approved. And some of the things that they put in there was like taking a chapter of Mein Kampf and just rewriting it, to say men rather than Jews, and that got approved and it got published. And it's like basically the status of academia right now in the social sciences, even before we talk about the reproducibility crisis, which I'll try to explain in layman's terms next, was that they'll take anything that sounds woke at this point, and that way they have this like, ammunition of, well, study X, Y, and Z says the following, and some of the stuff that they got approved was just preposterous. Like, dog humping in dog parks is evidence of rape culture, and perhaps if we can train dogs not to hump female dogs, then that means we can train men. That's another thing. They just made it up. They didn't there was never a study. Nobody was ever sitting in any dog parks observing dog humping, but they still, were able to get that published. And then whenever they were being edited, meaning, I don't want to say edited, but when they were going through the peer review, the peers are saying things that they want them to go even further, like to be even more ridiculous, to be even more woke about it. And, the reproducibility crisis is going on in all the social sciences, but it's a situation where in the scientific method, you're supposed to be able to repeat, a study and do it again. And there are some psychology studies that I use in my show, like I think it's called the Wilgram experiment. Like there are some that can be reproduced, but a lot of these just can't, and that's just like the study they did was to see how many could be reproduced. They were like, it was like 40, 50% or something. And that was just the ones they checked out, which what that's supposed to mean is if you can't reproduce it, according to the scientific method, it's supposed to just be an anomaly and thrown in the trash. And instead, what happens is it just stays in the textbooks, and That's a nightmare, especially
Mm-hmm.
because um, real world decisions are made based on what psychology professors and sociology professors tell people. They influence lawmakers, they influence, every facet of our life. And then they have the ability to tell you that you're just crazy. I'm going to segue just a brief moment. I did
Mm-hmm.
2 episodes about like the professor who went to Yale and gave the speech wherein she revealed that she had fantasies of shooting a white man or white people with a revolver if they got in her way. And then the
Mm-hmm.
other one that I read where they literally just put a social paper out there, and it's currently in journals now, suggesting that whiteness is a parasitic condition, like mental disease that they feel that psychology can treat. And they said that white people are far more susceptible to it, but other people can get it too. And I realized, oh, okay, so this is how we're going to explain when a person of color doesn't agree with critical race theory. We'll just say they're afflicted with whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, if you could go ahead and give me some commentary on your experiences with those things.
Whiteness is a fascinating abstraction of what they're targeting and vilifying, because it becomes a universal explainer, just like you mentioned. If you have any person of any color that deviates from the narrative or the ideology, it can simply be waved away by internalized whiteness, and they do this all the time. And the DEI consultancies that come in explicitly have been doing that, to explain why they're getting pushback from people of color, or why, say, Trump in 2020 gained voters among people of color, for example. So this is it reminds me of, before the Copernican revolution, and when we discovered that the planets circled the sun, there was this belief that the planets circled the Earth. And it was explained away, the differences in the orbits and so on were explained away by, things called epicycles, which were, strange variation in planetary movement. To preserve the theory, there's this thing, whiteness, which is, it functions the same way that epicycles function to preserve the Earth-centered universe paradigm. So it really is a universal rationalization that's not only just a rationalization, but one that it specifically targets a racial group. So I think when people are really up in arms, it's right, they should be, and I was too, about critical race theory. What the most debilitating for all races is this idea of critical whiteness studies, which is an offshoot of critical race theory.
Right. I noticed they have a branch for every race now.
Yeah. And when the way this started to really infiltrate my experience as a math teacher in my school, since many of the teachers at our school have multiple duties, I had a small advisory group where I had to align with a lot of this mission and push these ideas onto small groups of students that weren't directly related to math. Is that they wanted me to start doing that, and they started to, the real moment when I realized that I really couldn't participate in this was when they wanted me to teach this pyramid of racism, which I've talked about, elsewhere. But it's a pretty fascinating document in that it's a pyramid that with genocide at the top, and it organizes a whole host of relatively benign and in some cases virtuous behaviors underneath this pyramid, which means if you participate in any aspect of these other behaviors or mindsets, then you're promoting genocide.
So just for the sake of my listeners who don't watch my video versions, I want to read off some of these things. So like it's called the Pyramid of White Supremacy, and I will make this available to people. But some of the things that are on here are like 2 sides to every story is indifferent white supremacy, meaning the notion that there are 2 sides to every story. Not challenging racist jokes. Okay, I can get that one, but You know, prioritizing intentions over impact. So, like, your intentions no longer matter, just the effect of them. There's all kinds of crazy stuff on here. Suggesting that not all white people do X or Y is apparently also part of white supremacy. Things like false equivocation, which, and debating people on this topic, I noticed that they really abuse that debate tactic of like, this isn't really equivalent, but anyway, there's all kinds of stuff on here that is just like, especially there's two sides to every story. Okay, that's not true. So now what? There's just your version, right? Yeah, like your version of the
Right.
story. And that actually, while this is fresh in my head, I want to kind of, an analogy that maybe people might be able to wrap their heads around a little easier that I've been using is that this has become like a religion that is conducting a crusade that holds inquisitions that, use witch hunts to find blasphemers to be excommunicated. And I don't mean that to be hyperbolic at all. At a period of my life, I was studying religious persecution and what the inquisitions and the witch trials were like. And one of the things about this, it being an amorphous concept, is that you can just rewrite what it means in real time to suit you as the inquisitor. That's how you end up with insane, like witch trials, like I'm going to tie your arms behind your back to your legs and I'm going to throw you in a body of water. And if you float, then we have to kill you because you're a witch. But if you sink and drown, well, at least your soul is with God and you're not guilty. You end up in these scenarios where they could just redefine the rules and redefine what is racism. And in some of you can get a lot out of watching some of the protests because the students spit out stuff that, they may not necessarily have wanted to, but things like, no, we will tell you what is racist and what is not. We will tell you if you've heard us or if you haven't. People
and that raises a very important point. When you mentioned that last thing, it's something I wanted to talk about, which is in the schema that they've created, there is no way for a person who is an oppressor, so to speak, in some ways explicit, there is no way for that person to even identify their own blind spots. That is, the standard of evidence needs to be set by a person who is purportedly the oppressed. So you have, not only do you as an oppressor have blind spots if you belong to that group, you don't even know where those blind spots are until you are, you are told by an expert or someone who is well versed in the theory,
one of the appointed clergy who has
exactly
been authorized by the Inquisition for you to become a professional witch hunter. And and if they go to a village and they don't find evidence of the devil, it only means they haven't looked hard enough. It doesn't mean the devil isn't there. So somebody's always guilty. It's a mentality that can just take you over. And if you couple with that with the virtue signaling, which is I'm going to get social credits with people by being really good at this, lynching that is, that is the witch hunting, then it just creates a scenario where everybody feels compelled to try to analyze everything from that lens. And the other thing I would element is like when you say it's a problem you don't even know you have, it's an invisible problem. Just like say being under the influence of the devil. That's what you would have been told. Well, you don't realize this. But me, the appointed clergy, I can tell you that you're guilty. And the best way to know that you're guilty is that you told me you're innocent.
Yeah, and from a scientific perspective, anytime you have a premise that a force exists, which has very low effect sizes, but is universal, right? So like, for example, from the physical sciences, there was a thing called ether, and that was, everyone would spend all of this energy trying to detect the ether. So, in a sense, whiteness or structural racism is like that ghost in reality, which has a very low effect size in small localities, but overall it has it's said to have an immense effect. And whenever you have that kind of condition for, an understanding of reality, you have the potential for it to be, to create a kind of witch hunt where, things are ascribed to this ghost in reality when in fact, the standard, you don't need a standard of evidence because the assumption is there based in the narrative. So you can say, oh, it's whiteness or structural racism
Right.
because, what else could it be?
Right. And that reminds me of one of the ones that's on this pyramid that Jordan pointed out was like, that there's on here not believing people of color or their experiences, but at the same time, like, so in other words, it's bad not to believe them. You're supposed to believe all of them, but then it has in quotes, but my black friend said. So,
Exactly,
yeah,
directly contradictory, right? And I raised this to be fair, to give voice to the other side. I went to the DEI office. We called it the Office of Community Engagement, and I asked specifically, what can you tell me, what reconcile these contradictions? And the response to me was, oh, well, it depends on the context, right?
how convenient.
Yes. So, and I also said, well, are there other things? Is this pyramid comprehensive? Are all of the things on this pyramid the only things we need to worry about? They're like, no, there are other things that could be on this pyramid. This is an ever evolving document, right? So even if you were to take the step of, I'm not going to do any of these things, you could fall afoul of an unwritten rule, in which case, if totally at the mercy of anyone who either was a member of the oppressed group or spoke for that group to make the claim that, okay, there's this new thing that you just did, and we're going to add it to the pyramid. So you're not even protected if you follow the pyramid exactly, which is why the anxiety that produces causes, I believe, students and faculty to compels their speech within a very, very narrow range of what is acceptable to say. So that's why when we had these meetings, virtual and in person, you would just have this robotic repetition of the same phrases. And you see this in when, celebrities go on an apology tour, or anyone is trying to say the right thing on Facebook. They'll say, I'm doing the work, or I'm becoming aware of my privilege, or there's just a script involved there. Because if you deviate from the script, you're vulnerable to to canceling or
Well, right.
sanction.
And just like the witch trials, if you don't like someone, because I've watched these people fight each other, if you
Mm.
don't like someone, then you can just twist it around and then try to get a cancel mob after them. Well, they didn't, or they misgendered somebody, or they didn't, use the correct pronoun, or they didn't say the right racial, term, or, then even if it's from 20 years ago on their Twitter feed,
Mm-hmm.
that's another part of the mentality of these people that I don't think people recognize is, where do you need to be in your mind that you have nothing better to do with your time than to sit through 10 plus years of somebody's Twitter feed to look
Mm-hmm.
for something to destroy them with? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, what headspace are you in? Because I've tried to find tweets I did 3 months ago, and it takes a long time, but
Yeah.
you got to be meticulous. Now, as far as so as this evolved, this is actually what got me in touch with you, is I read your article, and I'll make sure I link that as well. But it was, I refused to indoctrinate my students, or what was the name?
It titles, I refuse to stand by while my students are indoctrinated.
Right. Yep. Okay. Yeah. I just pulled it up here. Now, some of the stuff you describe going on here, when you talk about how people are just kind of, they have all this anxiety because, God, I could say something wrong at any moment, and there's a scene that you kind of tell here where a student comes to talk to you and has to look around to see who's listening,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure they're not going to get in trouble. I mean, could you tell that story?
Yeah, I mean, by this point, I had run afoul. I had sort of transgressed by challenging the infamous slide of white supremacy culture, which is also, many of your listeners may know about this, but I had publicly questioned this at a meeting with a racially segregated meeting.
Right. Yeah, they
Yeah,
love segregation now.
yeah, with whites only students and faculty, whereas there was a simultaneous meeting with BIPOC students and faculty, Black and Indigenous people of color. But in any case, by this point, I had been sanctioned by the school. I was still teaching, but I had been publicly called out by the administration in front of all of the students. And I was a sort of a toxic individual, and this student wanted to offer me support because, and as I later found out, there were many students who actually supported, if not what I was saying, my right to question it. He wanted to come and give me his support, and so, but it was very furtive, and he was very scared because if any of his woke teachers saw him, or one woke teacher in particular saw him merely coming to my office, just coming to see me about anything. And my being adjacent to Mr. Rossi at that point would have put this child in a situation where he could have gotten a talking to, or he could have been reprimanded, or he would have been questioned for coming to see me. But
don't forget, this environment is to fight oppression.
Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah. And he kept looking around the corner and looking in the hallway. He was worried about there was a camera. We have cameras in the school to, it's a bit of a surveillance atmosphere in case there's an incident. But he felt that this camera could be used against him if the administration saw he was coming to see me, and it got around the school community. And his fears were not completely unfounded. I don't think that they were unfounded at all, because, as he told me, he'd been reprimanded for voicing certain opinions in his history class, and it was his history teacher that he was particularly concerned about. The opinions that he voiced that he was concerned about were not particularly alt-right or anything. I think, as he told me, it was, capitalism is not evil. Okay,
right.
This is the level of comment that raises eyebrows among the faculty. So he offered me his support, and I asked him why he was nervous, and he told me why. And it just became so obvious, clear to me, that this had gone around the bend. I mean, we had gone off the deep end at this point. If you have a student that can't even talk to a teacher because of this fear, it's
how to turn
it's
your
just
school,
not healthy.
How to turn your school into a cult 101.
Yeah,
turn it into a cult, complete with shunning.
And I want your listeners to understand that this did not happen all at once. It's very gradual. So, to sort of back up a little bit.
Sure.
After they made this commitment to anti-racism, the conversations that the DEI administrators were having with the faculty were relatively benign. Things like, well, we're going to be anti-racist. What does it mean to you? And so people would say, well, I think it means treating people of different races as individuals, and they would say, oh, that's interesting. Okay, why do you think that? So they were soliciting and validating where you were in the process of becoming a more enlightened individual. So, to them, there's a telos, there's an end point in mind where they want people to get to subscribe to all of these beliefs, but they're perfectly willing to guide you in your journey to coming to this higher understanding. And they were gradual about it. And so they would, and I thought, oh, this isn't too bad. So it kind of lowers your defenses. But then, gradually, as, I guess stories in the general culture and the country as a whole, from 2016 to 2020, there were several incidents that created a kind of feedback loop within the school where it was a heightened sensitivity to incidents, perceptions within the school of racism. And then that sort of became a kind of vortex that it gradually accelerated this.
Right.
And,
that's
then
an element that is very common. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's all right. Then they would come out with the pyramid of racism, and then they came out with the white supremacy slide. And so it just, whereas they wouldn't mention white supremacy in 2016, they felt that the environment was prepared enough where they could introduce that. And, I've just read, and I should have read it a long time ago. I read a book by the by the Polish-Lithuanian author Czesław Miłosz, who is, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he wrote, after the Soviets took over the Eastern Bloc countries in 1945, after the Second World War, the Iron Curtain didn't descend all at once. It was actually somewhat gradual. There was a tolerance for, that lasted a few years, I guess, or maybe, or a period of time for writers to continue to write, with a certain degree of freedom, or poets or thinkers to have an intellectual culture that was still relatively free. But the architects of the Iron Curtain, they had a plan in mind, and they rolled it out gradually. So and everyone has a breaking point, I think, but you might not know where that is until it's too late. So I just want people to keep an eye out, and the best defense against that is to document everything. I don't know what the state laws are in particular states, but it is very helpful to track and keep these PowerPoints, presentations, to make recordings where that's allowed. Just even for your own sanity, to sort of reflect on and listen to it later and think, is this okay? And ask yourself that, and share it with other people, and just have a reality check with people you trust, because they will leverage their authority to get you to sign on to things that are just wrong.
Now, the things that you were talking about, like when they were taking over the Soviet bloc countries, are exactly the kind of things that Yuri, the KGB,
Yuri Bezmenov, I think.
Right. Yeah. I'm always afraid I'm going to mispronounce it, but regardless, yeah, that's exactly what he was describing. He's like, it doesn't happen immediately. He even like has a time scale. Like this stage usually takes between 10 to 15 years. This stage takes he had it down because that's what his job was in the KGB, and he was doing it in India for them. And he was doing it as a journalist. He wasn't even a teacher, but he talked about how the teachers are immediately involved in this process. And it's basically, he gave an example of like one of his time frames, and he's like, why does it take this long? He's like, because this is the time period that it takes to indoctrinate an entire generation of children, into your new ideology. Mm-hmm. But also one of the things I think, again, to kind of like bring it back to those of my audience who may not, be as well read, but it's to say it's very similar, for example, again, to cults. They don't tell you the crazy stuff right out of the gate. They tell you that stuff after it's honestly, especially when kind of the thing that popped into my head when you were describing it is it's like grooming. You're grooming them. It's just as bad as somebody who's like trying to, has, bad intentions towards somebody. They're going to groom them, until they're more and more comfortable with it. And then the punchline comes.
That's a great way to put it.
Because you're trying to prepare them. I'll give one more story real quick. I had a coworker who, she was very bright, college-aged girl, and she knew that I had been involved in activism. So she started talking to me about. She's like, "Well, I went to a Black Lives Matter protest." I'm like, "Oh, okay, well, that's pretty cool. Tell me how it goes." And then, as the time goes on, I just noticed her starting to accept more and more very extreme ideas about race. And then I want to say it was about 11 months later, she was telling me that she was either not going to have children or would only have children with a black man. Like that is the level that she went from, and to, I guess to give the counter to that is like, if I had told her that that's what she would say 12 months earlier, she'd have laughed. Like, what? No, that's crazy. But her idea was that she wants to depopulate the white population. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen to everybody who goes to Black Lives Matter meetings, but the point is that there is a gradual process to it, and they do slowly cook you until you're ready for the big bam. And I think that slide I showed you is an example of a mistake, and one of the other things I'm stumbling across is that there are things that the teachers are literally told, this is the kind of part of the curriculum that you don't share with parents. Mm-hmm. Did you get any of that stuff while you were there, where they just kind of suggested, yeah, this doesn't go online, don't be public about this?
I was never directly told that, but I know that other teachers were very worried about how parents would interpret some of this information. And I don't know whether they were specifically instructed not to share it, but I should say in general that among my colleagues that were very left liberal, or I don't even want to say left liberal, because you can be left liberal and be perfectly okay. It's really just a particular, I don't know, CRT or woke point of
As
view. Is that
somebody on the left, I would clarify that what it is that that woke group is trying to claim you must participate in this stuff to be on the left.
yeah,
And they want it to sound like that. And if you're not this, you're on the left, which is part of the mental trick of packaging our politics in the first place. Like, I'm a pro gun rights, pro healthcare person. I'm supposed to not even exist. And there's a
hmm
societal pressure on you that if you feel this way, then you need to also feel this way, even about things that are not even related. So I can assure you there definitely are leftists who do not agree with any of this garbage, but
hmm
they're usually quiet because not even because they're afraid in so much sometimes as much as they just don't want to put up with what's going to happen when they're public about it.
hmm
That's sometimes just people just don't want to deal with drama. But anyway, continue with what
yeah,
you're
I totally get that, and I can understand.
I'm just afraid this drama is eventually going to come for you. You
Yeah,
can't stick your head in the sand.
I think it will, if it hasn't already. But one thing I did notice about back to the teachers and hiding things from parents is just a real contempt for parents as a moral force in children's lives. Like, to them, this was about usurping what it means to be a good person, and who is a better arbiter of morality for children. Is it the teacher or the parent? Now, they sometimes they would talk at the administrative level about how we work together and so on, but and the micro level for particular issues, particularly if you're talking about a teacher who is woke, and a parent who's conservative, there's just open contempt and almost a savior mentality. We need to we need to protect and rescue these children from their parents' influence,
Right. That's
because
actually.
it's
Go
harmful.
ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, because and then we can talk a lot about the language of harm, which is a huge part of this discourse.
Yep.
But I would say, uh, when for parents that are trying to work within institutions, um, don't I mean take with a grain of salt or an entire salt lick everything that parents or administrators will tell you, or that teachers or administrators will tell you, and really only look to policy changes and to things in writing, because that's the only thing that means anything. Because gaslighting and putting people off and humoring parents is really just part of the game. So, I can tell you from the inside, I've seen it happen. They did it to me as a teacher. They did it to parents. And that some parents who were against this stuff were just told, like, okay, it's a private school, of course, and they have the right to do this, but you could go somewhere else. This is not the place for you. But we're happy to take your money, but we're not going to listen to you if you don't align with our mission or
Well,
values.
and they're making it so that it's getting harder and harder to get away. Like one of the things that came up in when Bill Maher had, oh geez, I'm going to forget her name just because I need it, but a lady who used to work for Fox News.
Megyn Kelly.
Yeah, Megyn
Yep.
Kelly. She's
Yep.
like, I'm in New York, and I was, she's like, I want to take my kids to a different school, and then like, there's nowhere to go. They're in all the schools in New York now,
That's right.
and then like that thing that just happened with the teachers union. Maybe you can comment on that a little bit more, but I guess like one of the largest teachers unions just like said, yeah, we're going to teach CRT, and just left it at that. Did you have any? Go ahead and share whatever you know about that.
Oh, I just, I find the arguments that are by CRT apologists, for lack of a better phrase, to be very contradictory. At one level, they're not teaching in schools, and if they are, it's okay. And all we're teaching is to be conscious of racism in society, which is just that's not the problem. Okay, and to characterize it simply as that is just not what is the problem there. But the NEA is I guess they had a conference recently, or I really don't know the ins and outs of the organization, but they did come out and publicly call for a whole host of things, not just CRT in general, but an entire host of, I guess, woke causes. And then it got some press, and I think most recently I pulled it off their website. I haven't checked the website, but I saw on Twitter that
I've gotten
they
to the
pulled
point
it
now
off.
where I just take screenshots of anything that looks crazy, because
Yeah,
if you don't, that actually
you're
bringing
good.
it back to this conversation about
Policy.
the hatred of parents. On Tim Pool's show, he just had a guest who was a teacher, and she talked about this book called Not My Idea. And fortunately enough, I didn't have to buy it, because somebody is like reads it like a children's book, like you're watching somebody read a book on like a Sesame Street episode or something, and you can go page through page through. But part of it is literally undermining kids' relationships with their parents, and calling out specifically things that their parents may not talk to them about. And apparently this book is circulated at the elementary school level to like fourth and fifth graders, and the way it's written, you could go younger. You could probably read this to kindergartners. It's not complicated. The point is that, that's as soon as, and apparently that book was like bought in mass and is distributed in schools. And that's how they got their hands on it, and that's the part, like you said, the contempt. I completely believe that, because like, if you remember the kind of scandal when a teacher on Twitter pointed out that they didn't like this homeschooling thing because now the parents can overhear what I'm teaching in my classroom. And I get it. Not all parents are great. I'm not, that's not my point. And in some cases, I know, because I know abused children who have had to be rescued by teachers, or, but now it's like, we need to rescue them from what? That was one of the things actually that you pointed out I thought about, was that one of the conversations was reminiscent to something that happened on a Facebook group, that was situated around my town, because we were discussing this on a more public Facebook group for our school board, and we started getting deleted, like we started getting censored. So we created our own group, and in one of the arguments, this guy is like, well, the parents are not teaching their kids not to be racist, so the school system's going to have to do it. I'm like, whoa, buddy, put the brakes on here. I'll handle that. Thank you very much. And the other thing that was weird is that I've never encountered any racism in this town. And before I moved here, I spoke to people of color who lived here specifically, because when you're moving into the country, sometimes you can run into that. I didn't want my kids around it, and all the people of color I've spoken to about this community said it's fine. So the point is that they say, well, there's been incidents at the school. I'm like, really? Where? When? Who did it?
Yeah.
And and we're like, well, I can't talk about it. I'm like, well, no, I want to talk about it. Not just because of the fact that, I don't actually believe them necessarily. It's that if it is going on, I want it dealt with, and I want it dealt with aggressively,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm not tolerant of racism. That's definitely not the issue at all. And like my kids, my kids, like, because they're both in combat sports. Like if they saw somebody like mistreating a racist person, or like, mistreating a person in a racist fashion, I'm probably going to get a call, because something's going to happen. My kids will deal with it, So
Yeah,
but they, and that's what I kind of understood was the impression of a lot of people. I don't know what, it just seems like this idea that they believe that they can just brainwash our kids, and that's the function, of school, and then they wonder why parents don't like it, and I'm like, no, this isn't just going to be racist parents who are going to dislike what you're doing here, and one more element of this that bothers me that I pointed out, I was like, look, if you have actual racist kids, like the ones they were describing in these, alleged incidents, who are calling kids the N-word, I don't think any amount of trying to explain white privilege to them is going to change their minds. Like, they're not going to want to listen to a word you're saying. If you're talking about actual racist kids, like, there's a different way to approach that. It's much more gentle. It's much more humanizing of people of color. But you can't confront racist kids who are actually racist. And, it's funny that I have to make that distinction. What does racist mean? Like, you're talking about the word harm that keeps undergoing all these changes. They're trying to reword racism, but it's also like, I mean actual racist, not a kid who perhaps didn't like the Black Panther movie, and is therefore racist, or maybe they, I don't know, used a problematic word. I mean, full on legit racist kids. And I know they exist in the world. I've seen them, but and it seems to me like they don't want to engage, about those incidents. They just kind of want to say that they happened and then not have to provide any evidence. And, the thing is that I also know the principals of our schools they'd be on that, like flies on excrement. There's no way. We could never get away with that. And I'm happy for that. I'm more like concerned that they're saying there's these incidents and I'm not hearing about them. But anyway, go ahead.
You're making me laugh with the Black Panther thing, because I was in a group with students and teachers, and everyone was excited about the movie, and I said, I didn't see it. I don't think I'd like it. And immediately all the antenna went up, and they were like, "What do you mean? Well, why wouldn't you like it?" I said, I don't like superhero movies. I mean, it's not. I'm not a fan of kind of those types of movies. I find them boring. Right. So if you take that impact over intent thing and you place it on that situation, the impact of Mr. Rossi not liking Black Panther in front of a group that is going to feel it as a racialized opinion, and my intent, meaning, is completely benign. I just don't like superhero movies. And what does that say about that impact over intent thing? And what claim do I have under the rubric of impact over intent to use my not liking superhero movies as an excuse for vocalizing my dislike of Black Panther? Right. And so these things they're just toxic little maxims that are going to perpetrate these misunderstandings and potential for weaponizing, just differences of opinion.
And when you bring up impact over intent, I kind of just had a click in my mind that, like in the Brett Weinstein incident where they went after him at Evergreen College, he wrote an email that said that and this would be a good segue into harm, but he wrote an email that just said, "I don't agree with the idea of excluding all white people from the campus for one day," and they wrote, basically they wrote into that, and not as in literally wrote it, but like, he's a racist. You said racist things, on your email, and you harmed children in this college. Like, you need to apologize to all the people you did harm to. Well, what is harm? Well, it's whatever I say it is. I felt harmed, so therefore you're guilty. Never mind what you said or what what you meant to say. If I've decided that what you've said harms me, then I'm automatically empowered to label you guilty of that, and you are automatically required to do recompense. And if you refuse to do so, then it only means far worse things about you are true. And that's the element of it. Again, it's like a witch hunt. We'll tell you what is heresy. We'll tell you what the devil is. And if you question us, we are the appointed clergy, then you're in trouble, because you arguing with us is evidence of your guilt, and that's an element to this that, because we're talking about the scariest element of it. And I think it was good that you kind of tried to bring us back a bit more into chronological order, because people are going to listen to some of the stuff we're saying and just roll their eyes like that's never going to happen, and they don't understand how this works. I mean, that was new information for me. I didn't realize we've been dealing with this problem since 2015. Like, holy crap, like so much has happened between now and then, and that they were just kind of lying in wait and waiting for the right opportunity, and that I think is what they feel that they have, and that actually kind of brings me to another point when we're talking about Brett Weinstein, is that, okay, so I guess it was actually Robin DiAngelo, the author of the book White Fragility, which I might add our school board was told they needed to have a discussion about, like it was actually put on the agenda. She was apparently the author of the poster that was put on the African American History Museum through the Smithsonian, that identified the scientific method and critical and rational thinking as elements of white culture, as in elements of whiteness. And at first I'm like, well, that's, do they mean that in some metaphorical way? And then I'm watching the documentary about what happened to Brett Weinstein at Evergreen College. And there's a moment where one of the students is arguing with him as he's trying to, calmly talk to them. And he says, the student literally screams at him, "You need to stop demanding that people use logic and reason and white forms of information." And then it
Hmm.
just kind of exploded in my head like, oh, that's what this is about. We don't want to have to
Yeah.
make any sense. And if you demand that something's making sense, then you're racist. That's what you're
Right,
trying to
right.
do.
Well, it's funny. Because I got in trouble for questioning the same thing that you're talking about, as operative there in that context, which is the white supremacy culture, the 15 aspects of white supremacy culture, which, objectivity, individualism, um, and among them, the right to comfort, which is a funny one. But I looked into it, and there's absolutely no scholarship behind it whatsoever. It was concocted in 1999, a long time ago, by a woman named Tima Okun, who is if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, she was an activist in the Bay Area, and she led several seminars in anti-racism at the time. And it was, as she writes herself on her own website, it was something that she came up with one night after a particularly difficult and exhausting intervention or workshop. And, only 10 years later did she, do a PhD thesis about it. And it was the standard of evidence was autoethnography. That is just, if I experience it, therefore it's data and it's legitimate.
And what's
So,
funny
yeah,
about that is that they want all experiences, what do they call the life experience of people of color, to be sacrosanct, unable to be in any way opposed. But if you as a white person share something with them, then it is anecdotal. We're literally talking about the same
right.
thing, but it's different if a black person or a Hispanic person or whatever engages in it. Well, then it's life experiences, and whatever they tell you their lived experiences are, you need to listen to that without question. That's actually on that pyramid,
And
and
I would add to that the standard is even higher. It's not merely that the person has to be a person of color for them to be listened to. They have to actually say the right things. So, for example, when you're
oh,
talking
right,
about, you spoke to people in your community, you spoke to black people. What is really curious about the level of racism? When you got an answer that didn't fit the narrative, those people shouldn't be listened to either. So it's not just, are you a member of the right group? You have to be a member of the right group and saying the right things.
right, and that's why they've always. It's weird because they kind of get awkward for a moment if a person of color weighs in on this and not going along with the program, because if there's no person of color present, the first card that they'll play, as if like, if we were playing Magic the Gathering or something, the first card
Mm-hmm.
they'll play disqualifies the white person because they're white. And then when the black person steps up and says the same thing, then they have to play a different card. Oh, okay, but well, not all people of color.
Well,
It's like
that's where the internalized whiteness card comes in. Now
right,
they may not explicitly say it because it might be too incendiary, but that will be the thing that they use subsequently to frame the issue.
right,
Um, right? They'll say, "Oh, we had, well, like, who was the politician? I think it may have been Ayanna Pressley or one of the members of the squad
right.
explicitly said, we don't need black people who give us, who aren't using black voices." It was that crude, essentially, but it was a
Right.
literal quote.
No, I've
I mean,
heard
I'm
things
trying to get
exactly like that.
as close to that as possible. Maybe I'm
Right.
paraphrasing a little bit, but
Or
that was
speaking with good
definitely,
English, I've heard people say if you're speaking with like, refined English, then you're talking white,
yeah,
But I've heard that even before all of this. That's when I lived in the ghetto, if kids spoke well, that was something that would literally get you beat up. And it didn't
yeah.
matter what color you were, but they would tell the black kids you're talking white, as if like there's a racial, adjustment to that, and actually, so as we're talking about this, I was hoping maybe you could help me understand this because I've been trying to catch information on it, and I read about it a little bit, but since you're a math teacher, you might be uniquely qualified to explain this. But there's this concept that apparently 1 plus 1 doesn't necessarily have to be 2.
Oh, yes, yes.
Go ahead and give me that one because I still
Um,
couldn't wrap my head around it.
well, I think that you usually hear it if you were going to look on Twitter or Google, 2 + 2 = 4. So there was a huge brouhaha about this on Twitter with James Lindsay, who was one of the authors of the Grievance Studies affair you mentioned earlier, where he was saying that no, actually 2 plus 2 equals 4, as kind of a provocation for everyone on the woke side of the equation, so to speak, to weigh in and say, no, actually, sometimes 2 plus 2 can be 5, sometimes 2 plus, depending on how you think of 2 and 2. So, there is a situation where, depending on how you frame the concept of number and quantity, it is possible through semantic reframing to make this claim that 2 plus 2 equals 5. For example, if you take 2 units and you add it to 2 units, well, then you have 4 units, but you also have the set of all 4 units, which counts as one extra thing. So that's just one example. So it's a kind of sophistry based around manipulating the meanings of the categories. But the point of all this, the real agenda behind it, is to demonstrate to undermine and deconstruct the idea of objectivity itself, and to say that we construct, objectivity itself is a kind of social construction that's based on language games, and that there's not an actual truth to this, and that it dovetails with certain pedagogical practices around the idea of sort of like learning by discovery, where you can you can make an investigation. That's actually a good thing. And you don't need to sacrifice one for the other. You can have objectivity and learning by discovery, or project-based learning, right? Where you can think of number in unique ways. But it is unquestionably true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, if everyone agrees on the meaning of 2 and the meaning of plus and the meaning of equals, right? Like you can't get around. I mean, you want to quibble about the definitions of these concepts. Well, then we can all play that game, and it's a fun game to play. But
what that reminds me of? Yeah. It reminds me of how different religious denominations come to pass. They're all supposedly reading from the same Bible, yet now we have drastically different interpretations that lead to, well, I'm a Mormon, or I'm a Catholic, or I'm a Jew, or I'm, and they're supposedly all the same source material. And that's, again, this is no offense to anybody who's religious listening, obviously. But the point is that there are people who can twist religions. And I think even, good Christians acknowledge that. But the point is that when it comes to this, when I was kind of just putting it all together in my head, I'm like, who the hell would want to tell their students to stop using logic and reason? Well, that would be people who are full of shit, and who would want to de-emphasis on the scientific method? Well, why would they not like the scientific method? It would probably be because the first place they infiltrated is the social sciences, and they know that a lot of the crap that they're putting out is not reproducible, and they'd like us to stop worrying about that. They'd like us to stop being concerned that you can't reproduce it. And when you said there's no science, that put in my head, like that article that I read about whiteness being a parasitic condition. He didn't cite a single study anywhere. He gave two descriptions of his interactions with patients, one of which was racist, and the other of which was just a woman who was having problems with her husband. And I'm like, this is not science. This is not information. And it's funny is that because I was doing a whole series on Do You Think for Yourself? So I started to look for those replicatable studies. And they were so arduous in the way that they collected data. Like we interviewed this many people. This is what they told us. None of that is in any of these papers. There's none of that. It's like they're just talking. That guy, it's like he hid it behind what I call $50 word salad. So word salad is a concept on its own, where I just kind of blab and sound like I answered you. But then you make it $50 words, meaning just really big words, and then you just throw them in the salad. And then if a person doesn't have as high a vocabulary as you do, they tend to back off and they think, oh, well, that guy's smart. Maybe he's right. There are people who make that their entire world. This is how they talk to people. Like that Ibram X. Kendi guy. He's a good at it. Or what is his name? I think his last name is Dyson, but he's a big,
Michael Eric Dyson.
Right.
Yeah.
He is bad at it. Oh man, and I can understand him because I have a vocabulary, but I'm like, okay, so he just repeated, it's like he gets out a thesaurus. He's like, I'm going to use 4 fancy words for the exact same concept. Sometimes in rapid fire succession. It's like he has a gun in his hand with he sets it on automatic, and he's like, and then but the point is that it blinds the audience. They start spending too much of their mental energy trying to remember the definitions of the words and not looking at the fact that he doesn't have any substance. And
Yeah, no,
when
he's a really good. He is a very highly skilled grandstander.
right.
There's very like I remember seeing him in a debate with Jordan Peterson,
Yep, I was just
that
thinking about
that
that.
thing, and he's just very, very good. And at a certain point, you just have to kind of tip your cap to the rhetoric. Yeah, it's BS, but
When that
um,
wasn't working with Jordan, though, he just
yeah,
started
no,
turning into a bully. Like he
right,
started
right,
repeating the things Jordan was saying in a taunting tone. I'm like, you sound like a sixth grader cyberbullying somebody. Like
right,
that's a
right.
guy I just wet my chops like, oh my God, I would love to debate you. Because if you know what to do to expose them, you can get through. But anyway, back to how this is relevant to this. It seems like they're really reliant on that. Like, I don't know if you watched the clip of Ibram X. Kendi defining racism, but he broke a rule that I learned in like the first grade that you're not supposed to use the word that you're defining in your definition. In
Hmm.
fact, he said the word racism, I think, like 6 times in his definition of racism. It's racism is racist this, racist that. I was like, oh my goodness. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and that guy gets
Circular
paid.
reasoning.
He got paid $20,000 to give a school a 45-minute Zoom call presentation. Like that's the other
Hmm.
element to this is there's money being made. It's not all just about the insidious elements of like, even a communist, plot. It's also just that these people are making bank. Like somebody
Hmm.
pointed out that Robin DiAngelo gets paid more than most of the black speakers on the circuit talking about racial issues, and
Hmm.
that's one of the reasons why, because that's the other thing is that why do they have this motive to bring this to your school? It's because they want to teach it, and they want to get paid. Like the
Right.
idea that a school paid $20,000 to listen to that guy on Zoom for 45 minutes, like I just can't even, even for an in person, it's not just about me disliking him. I cannot imagine a public school paying anybody $20,000 to even come and talk in person. Like
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean,
do you
as I recall, there was a pretty small, it was a small community. I mean, not a large tax base that paid that much for him to come in. And you think you're talking about taxpayers here, you're like not well-heeled people. I mean, I don't think it seems almost kind of cruel. We're going to sell you back. We're going to sell division back to you, and you're going to pay for it.
right? Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly. But that's but it kind of it pushes towards motive. Like, why do they need this to be what it is, and then why do they need it to be so confusing? That's something a lawyer told me once. He's like, the reason why all this stuff is so complicated is because we want to get paid to be the ones who know how to deal with it. Like
oh yeah, yeah,
if all was
that's
simple, then you wouldn't need us. And it's again a scenario that I don't know if people, especially like in a poor community, do we think that any of the kids of color got anything out of that guy doing a Zoom call for 45 minutes that they could not have got? They had to
mhm.
have been able to get something better with $20,000. You know,
Yeah, I think that to a large extent, it really just is counterproductive for the kids that it's ostensibly supposed to serve. Because there was what it is. It's a kind of performative minstrelsy on the part of the white people who are aligned with it, and it very like to a large degree, it completely is irrelevant to the kinds of needs that the students of color would actually benefit them and give them real social capital and opportunities. Um,
well, and
in
that's
that and it's alienating. It's alienating. I can tell you from these meetings that I've been in, students of color just saying like, how does this benefit me? What is this? This is a waste of my time. And it seems like it is. I mean, I don't know. Listening one after the other as white students and faculty are announcing their privilege and their commitment to the work, and so I mean, how is that relevant to them getting support in their studies and their homework, or maybe getting a leg up in society? I don't see it.
well, and it's the thing is that I went to school in those neighborhoods that are considered to be the predominantly black communities, and I think that the real problem is something that people don't want to face, and I'm the one of the coaches for a team that comes from that neighborhood, and I drive my son like an hour out of our way to go be part of that team because he has a lot of friends there. And even the black coaches are like, this is crap. Like my kids don't need this. Like he's like, my kids need mentors. My kids need people to encourage them. And that's why he runs this wrestling team in this neighborhood, but also, I think that it basically amounts to this. Where I went to school, using big words would be an excuse to punch somebody. Turning in your homework. Yeah, sure, maybe. Do you have any plans outside of it? And this is for everybody who lives there. This is not a black problem. This is it's in these communities in general. The Hispanic kids have this problem. The white kids have this problem. It's a cultural issue. How do you fight that? Because the problem is that you've got to make doing well in school cool again in an environment where, because like my younger sister was completely sucked into this, because when we moved into the ghetto, she was only like 5. And if you ever saw the two of us talking, you'd never believe we were related, because she's of a different culture. It's like she comes from a different country. It's like trying to talk to somebody from the very deep South. You're talking to a person of a completely different world, but that world venerates crime, looks down on doing well in school, looks down on getting a job, and in that scenario, you're supposed to try to pass classes, and I remember kids hiding their report cards because they didn't want anybody to know they had done well, because they didn't want to get picked on or beat up. Like, how do we solve that problem? Well, I don't think you could just throw money at it. And I don't think that showing up to tell everybody there that the real problem is the white oppressor who's not even there. There's such a small percentage of us were white there. There's a moment in Lean On Me where he says, I need all my white students to stand up, because he's pointing out these people have the same problems you do, and, I've used that clip from time to time, but people can't wrap their head around it. They're so caught up in this idea. No. We jealously guard that it's our race that is the most oppressed. Our race is the one that has the most problems. And I remember this when I was at Occupy, because these politics destroyed Occupy Detroit, and we didn't really have them in Occupy Flint. I was at 2 different camps. So what ended up happening is people start fighting over which one of them is the more oppressed, because it becomes a way to basically become popular. And in popularity, I mean like your place in the social hierarchy. But anyway,
I was at Zuccotti Park, for a while there. I didn't sleep there overnight or anything, but I was really curious about what was the dynamic, and just anecdotally, I saw much the same thing happen.
Right, and that's the funny thing is when it started, it was so beautiful. Like everybody, it was so colorblind, gender neutral. It didn't matter where you were, it didn't matter where you were from, and I'd be standing shoulder to shoulder with people that I'd never met who were from completely different parts of the culture. But we were all unified in one purpose, and then all of a sudden we're not. Now it's, the BLM part of the group, which BLM didn't exist, but basically the people who were focused on black rights, we want this issue, and then the gay people show up and they want this issue, and then then it came down to, like, I remember at one point they didn't want to let white males talk a certain period of time, and that brings us back to like the concept that only certain people can experience this. And if you're not in the oppressor class, then you shouldn't be allowed to talk on it. I'm sorry, if you are in the oppressor class, and of course, unless you're, infected by the parasitic condition of whiteness and happen to be black, then you're also not allowed to talk about it. Even if you did experience those things, even if you, like one of my friends is a guy named Rob, who we became friends because we were in the same Facebook group arguing about something like this. And I think it was like 3 different white people were like, you're not allowed to talk about this, because you're white. And then he just said, you know what? No, because he's a black guy. He's like, no, you're not allowed to talk about this. He is. I gave him permission. And the funny thing is that even though it sounded silly, they obeyed. Like they just stopped talking because a black person told them to stop talking. The problem is that if we start, basically weighing whether or not something is valid based on the color of the skin of the person, based on whether or not they're straight or not, based on whether or not they're, the whole long list of oppressed groups, then that ends up becoming more important than the actual validity of the argument, which is what Check Your Privilege was all about. It was like, again, if we use the analogy of a card game, I'm losing, so I just throw out the check your privilege card, and now I'm suddenly winning, even if everything I just said was absolute nonsense. And that's not good for education either.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of direct things back a little bit more to kind of get an image for my audience about what life was like at the school. I don't think we spent enough time
Mm-hmm.
at that, but obviously you have students that are scared to talk to you. You have, teachers and faculty that are essentially shunning you,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess if you could just share some more experiences of how that was, and I mean, then I think it'd be valuable to people to understand the gravity of what we're discussing. That if this gets out of control, this is what you're looking at.
Yeah. I had the years for the few years leading up to this, I had a sense of whether other faculty were also troubled by this. I didn't really have a good sense of what the student body was feeling, whether the extent to which students felt silenced or that they couldn't voice alternative opinions to things. But since the article came out and I went public, I did receive a substantial number of emails from students and alumni, students that I taught in previous years. I've been there. This was my 9th year at the school. Overwhelmingly, proportionally supportive of me doing what I did and saying that they experienced very similar things and that I was not wrong as to what I was seeing from the students, just watching body language and watching their behavior in some of these meetings and workshops and so on. And that I felt reinforced and validated by that. I think that was really, I kind of felt that my instincts were correct. And then there was subsequently a study that was done by the school, supposedly anonymous, of the student body and the teachers included in the survey, out of a school community of about 400 people or so, 420 people. The response rate was only 25%. I found out later from the students that a lot of didn't participate because you had to sign in with your school email to participate. But even given that small response rate, you can see it online. It's published online under the Grace Gazette. It's the name of the school paper. And I actually do commend them for publishing the results because it clearly indicates that there's a problem. So if just going through some of the top line results on the survey, do you feel comfortable expressing an uncommon opinion at our school? It was, 43% said yes, and so the student body is extremely divided. And there are a lot of qualitative responses as well. People writing in anonymously about how they felt about, were they able to voice conservative opinions or challenge some of the rhetoric that was being pushed on them. And it was I think a clear validation of my article, and that it definitely showed that there is a problem at the school. That's something that I found really interesting. And, personally going to work every day. I mean, I worked, we were teaching hybrid this past year. And so I was going in, most of my colleagues were going in every single day teaching on Zoom and to a room of students at the same time. And it was an onerous technical hurdle to make it work and to set it up, break down when we have no passing time between classes and so on. So it was difficult to do. It was difficult work, challenging work, teaching in that environment and with those limitations. And just going about my day after all these things had happened and I was being shunned was hard. It was a grind, and it felt really alienating and disturbing. But I did feel like, since the moment when I spoke out in February, I did feel like I was right with God. I don't know how else to put it, but I felt like I had done the right thing for speaking up. And it was like there was a kind of inner peace to my experience. Whereas for all of these years previously, I had just been grumbling into my beard and and complaining and griping silently. It just felt like a weight had been lifted. So it was simultaneously a kind of social stigma, but a kind of inner feeling of well-being, I would say.
And I could see where it would, and I know that, for me, my particular scenario is that from a very young age, for whatever reason, I perceived social interactions in a way that was, I guess, more sociological. Like I could watch groups of people interact and kind of get a sense of what was going on, in a way that wasn't necessarily what everybody thinks about. And what I kind of experienced, like I remember once I was talking to a counselor because they thought I was depressed or something, and they said, "What's bothering you?" And I gave them this in-depth analysis of the hierarchical structure of my middle school and how certain kids, this group was popular and this group was not, and then the guy said, where did you study sociology? And I said, "What's sociology?" Like I didn't even know there was a separate science. Anyway, I don't know if like this puts me on the Asperger's spectrum or something, but the other element of it is that I don't really have the same levels of social anxiety. What bothers me more is when something wrong is going on, that drives me nuts. Like it literally, like I am more bothered by that. But what I kind of noticed was that there are layers to these things. And when you were talking about the support you got, I was actually just talking to Tara Reid about this when I interviewed her the other night, was that so you run into the people who social pressures, maybe they're not bright enough to be aware of them, and they just go along with whatever the group says. Or they are aware of them, but they don't necessarily have the ability to, to fight, like I guess I'll just say the spine, to be willing to say anything, So there's that layer. Then the next layer is the group of people who maybe they'll send you a private message on Facebook, telling you that they agree with you, but they're not going to say anything, and they don't want you to say anything. And then the next layer are the group of people who are also extremely aware of it. And the reason they don't like you is because they're using it to control other people, and you present a threat to them. Because
that's an interesting one.
Because you're not under their spell. And in particular, then they wonder, well, is he trying to take control? And I would say that, because I've met a lot of people over my life that, different injustices would happen, and, they're completely aware of it. They don't agree with it. They definitely don't support that this thing happened, but they can't get involved because they're worried about how it's going to impact them. The problem is that if you get enough of those people together, then a whole lot of bad things can happen. It also creates a situation where inaction, like I remember once I was running for president of a nonprofit organization, and as you can imagine, being an outspoken person, I was somewhat controversial. The thing is that the things I was outspoken about were not unpopular necessarily. They were just things that were awkward and people didn't talk about it. And one of the pitches I pointed out, because they're like, "Well, I want to vote for you, but you'll never win." And I'm like, "Well, it's interesting you say that because 70 people just told me that." I'm like, there's actually a lot more of you than you think. And the only reason that somebody pushing what I'm pushing isn't winning is because you all believe that. And I'd say that goes on in just about everything. But, and that's one of the reasons why my heart was kind of warmed that now grassroots groups are coming together. Like that was actually revealed to me on the Tim Pool podcast I was just talking about earlier, that they are trying to come together to help parents organize to stop this sort of thing before it gets in, and that's one of the reasons we talked about the fact how gradual it is, and I think that we're probably fortunate in my community that we should be able to stop it. And I've already spoken to some of the people who would have to vote on this stuff who've already said, no, this isn't going to pass. But you have to be vigilant because one of the things about it is that they take over these offices that nobody even knows about. The kind of stuff that's on your ballot that you go, oh, okay, I guess I'll vote R because I'm a Republican. You may not know anything about that person's job. Like does anybody know what a county commissioner is? A lot of people don't. So that's an example, and in fact, in local politics, when I ran for Congress, one of the things I learned was how many people don't even know who their congressman is, so they infiltrate on these lower level, grassroots level things. And the objective there is that if you take over school board, you think, well, that's not a big deal. Then you think, no, now I've taken over the school board's in, say, 60% of the country,
Mm-hmm.
and then that becomes 70 and then 80. And then before you know it, because none of you paid any attention to these lower level elections, now these people are setting policy on a grand scale. And I think that that's kind of evidenced by this recent, adoption of this stuff by the largest teachers union. And I've encountered different conversations. I actually did a brief video of a Twitter conversation where all these teachers were coming together saying, you can't stop me from teaching this. I'm just going to teach it anyway. And if you fire me, I'll use my white privilege to just go get another teaching job. And then this guy said that. And then I swear I was scrolling down for an hour of different teachers going, yeah, me too. Oh yeah, I've already done it. And then they're exchanging strategies, how easy it is to slip it into math, to just tell them statistics for things that are, relevant to this stuff. It's oh my God.
Oh yeah. So this is something I've seen in the response to the parent pushback and the kind of, the huge domination of the news cycle by this issue lately, is that there's a doubling down, a tripling down. I've been to some seminars, virtual seminars with DEI consultancies that are offering, and they're giving explicit tactics and strategies for how to deal with parents who are being more vocal about this, and it is a full-on doubling down. I mean, in one of the seminars, the head of the organization, a fascinating guy actually, Dr. Rodney Glasgow. He runs an outfit called the Glasgow Group, which is a very influential DEI consultancy in New York, LA, and Chicago for private schools. He made an explicit connection between parents who are voicing displeasure with critical race theory in the schools and the January 6th rioters at the Capitol, and connecting that to slave owners. So, they are just lumping in this giant bucket. If, being very explicit with excellent, really, I tip my cap to the sophistry, but storytelling in framing parents as, KKK members essentially. And it's a drastic framing. But
it's how many different degrees of Kevin Bacon are you? I don't know if you remember that joke.
Yeah, yeah.
How many different things do I have to link together to get back to Kevin Bacon?
Right. Well, it's done subtly, right? He starts. It's a keynote speech. If anyone wants to Google it, it's fascinating. It's on the Dalton School. The Dalton School is a private school, very prestigious in New York, and they have a conference every year on diversity issues, and this fellow gave the keynote speech, and I urge everyone to watch it. At least watch the last 8 minutes of it. It's on you can find it on Google, because it really gives. I want parents and anyone who's standing up for against this to understand what you're up against, in that you really are dealing with activist ideologues who are seeking to mint new child soldiers essentially for these causes, and they're not going to be dissuaded or put off by statutes at the state level or even the local level, because in the classroom the teacher has tremendous power to teach what they want, and to get people out of these positions is what it's going to take. You're going to have to actually mobilize people to go into education programs and become teachers with different ideas. And that's why I think that this is going to take decades to,
right.
And that what we may be seeing now, I hope, is the sort of high water mark.
That's one of the things that Gary said, was that it takes almost an equal amount of time to undo what they've done, which is unfortunate. But, I agree, not just about becoming teachers, but also it puts situations because I just said this on our forum for my community recently, was it's not going to be enough to just stop this at the curriculum level. We're going to have to start paying attention to new teachers who've been hired. Because it was one of the things that was unique about your school, you pointed out, was because it was a new school, it was full of very young, fresh out of the college brainwashing system teachers.
Yeah.
It'll be harder where I live because a lot of these teachers have been doing this for a really long time. Like they haven't been to college in double digits of years. They haven't been taught this stuff, or rather, I guess, indoctrinated into it. But they will trickle their way in. And I guess it kind of falls to, I mean, it's been a while since I looked at this. It falls to school principals in that end. We're going to have to be held accountable to don't hire people like this. And if they do something like this, but that's the funny thing is like, my kids are old enough now that I'm not worried, and they're also kind of politically minded. They listen to my podcasts. They listen to stuff that I do on YouTube that's much more free thinking. I'm not worried about them getting brainwashed by it. I'm worried about, they're going to tell my son, for example, something that is ridiculous, and he's going to tell them that, and then he's going to get disciplined for it.
Yeah.
That's why when you describe that scenario with your kid, I'm like, oh man, I'm like, if my kids are in that scenario, it would be so bad. But it was really chilling reading your article at just the environment that they had created. And that's why I had to spit out, don't forget, this is to just stop people from being oppressive. We need to have this, KGB society running everything. And I don't even mean KGB in the sense of the communist takeover. I just mean the idea of, the way Russians were terrified that the KGB might overhear anything that they say at any given time. And ironically, also to protect us from fascism, despite the fact that one of the cornerstones of fascism is censorship. That's one of the things I pointed out I was on a more conservative podcast. And I went, why is it that it's the anti-fascists that keep pushing for censorship? Help me with that one. But it's, I guess, I hope that, for you, I mean, obviously, I believe you said on one of the other interviews I listened to that they just kind of decided they just weren't going to renew your contract, so there's going to be penalties for you. But it almost seems like another thing that kind of occurred to me is now that everybody's developing these charter schools, that it may come particularly to the conservative minded types. They may need to just find people who, even if they're not, outright totally conservative, just people they know that are against this and just start building their own institutions.
Yeah, I think that is, I mean, it seems like every parent I talk to is really hungry for alternative institutions and schools that can offer, just a classical liberal education, and a sense of community, but without all this nonsense. I think, there's such a hunger for it, certainly at in large cities among, independent school culture. I just think the first person that can get the money together and open a whole network of schools around those ideas is going to have people lining up around the block.
Especially with this new proliferation of online schools. I mean, mind you, they have their own problems. And I encountered that because we did online this year, where I kind of had to make sure that I was vigilant myself, to make sure that everything's getting done and all that, but, it would seem that if it comes down to it, because a lot of people are talking about homeschooling, and not everybody's in a position to do that. Like, I mean, if I wasn't, it helps that through most of this time I've been home because I've been injured. So I've been able to work. But like, if I wasn't, I don't, it's like, man, that's, it's tough to do homeschooling. I don't think people realize just that it's not as easy as they think, but it may literally just come down to basically creating the, the free market, so to speak. I, as a leftist saying those words, I'll probably have to go take a shower after the broadcast. But my point is that to use the market of like, okay, well, fine, you do that. We're not doing that. And it doesn't even have to be that we're going to have a Fox News, make America great again school. It means we need to have a school where this isn't like a requirement, for you to adhere to our principles or ideologies, meaning, to be able to pass our damn grades, and especially since the kids that are coming out of this stuff, they're not just on the level of like, I guess the kids who are getting to college, like they have more social anxiety. They have more psychological problems. They have more, like they're getting to colleges and they have no resilience. And they, that's a separate topic, but I think it kind of rings back to the way that we've been changing the way we raise our kids, so when they're in that vulnerable state, I think that makes them even more susceptible to, oh, well, I know why, you have all this anxiety. It's because of all this racism, or it's because of all this sexism. It's because of, because you're trans, or it's because you're this or you're that. You just didn't know it, rather than actually just giving them the ability to think, and cope, and be able to handle adversity,
Yeah.
and be able to handle, that's another thing I think I've been telling, my conservative listeners. I'm like, look, you're not going to agree with everything that's about to be said because I'm bringing on somebody leftist, but I'd like you to challenge yourself to listen to this broadcast and think about the things I'm saying that you do agree with, and things about the things that my guests are saying that you do agree with, because it's healthy for you to do that. And I do the same thing. I listen to stuff that I don't quite agree with, and people don't do that. Like, you bring up Jordan Peterson. I can't even use a Jordan Peterson link to talk to somebody on the left because they've all convinced themselves that he's this hard right, alt right. Like, I'm like, guys,
Right.
I don't agree with everything he says either, but that's all nonsense. That's not true.
Yeah.
So, but regardless, I want to thank you for coming on and discussing your story with me. I know you said you took some notes about things you wanted to bring up that maybe you didn't get a chance to talk about before. Do you want to go over that now?
Yeah, there's one thing I wanted to highlight again for parents that are interested in keeping, or creating or resuscitating school boards or public school system, is that they keep an eye out for the younger grades, because the way that these consultancies are structuring their curricula for the kindergarten through sixth grade in particular is a moral education that they're pushing. They're pushing an alternative moral education, and that requires a child to have a different understanding of their identity. So if you look at, for example, there's a consultancy in New York called Pollyanna, and they have a very highly regarded K through 8 curriculum, and it's called the racial literacy curriculum. And essentially, what it is it starts out with a recognition in kindergarten of the importance of colors. In fact, they have eight lessons specifically about just recognizing color, and then they will gradually take it into the realm of identity. And so, they'll do these things called identity wheels, where you start out describing, or the student will start out describing things about themselves, like, oh, I like ice cream, or my favorite color is orange, or I like horses, or whatever. And then they will gradually seduce, and I use that word specifically on purpose, they will seduce them into identifying with their socially imposed identity, whether that's racialized, or your ethnic identity. And then that gradually takes precedence over their personal identity, their dreams, aspirations, goals, character, all the things that make you a moral agent in society gets replaced with the solidarity for your group identity. And then once that is instantiated, once that child has internalized their socially imposed identity as more important than their personal identity, they can layer sort of like think of it like an operating system. They've installed the operating system, and then subsequent grades, they can layer all of the history and social studies, and all of the teaching of reality around that identity, so that instantiates you as a member of a marginalized group, or an oppressor group, or privileged group, or what have you, because they've already made that transition into being having a solidarity with a particular group, whether that's as a white person, where they can leverage your guilt around your privilege to get you to accept certain stereotypes about yourself, or as an oppressed group, as leveraged that group identity to accept a whole set of other criterion. So I find that to be really the most disturbing thing, because they understand that children see the world in moral primary colors, and if they can set that palette early, instantiate that in their minds, it's an incredibly potent and debilitating thing that's going on right now. And so pay attention to the younger grades first, because as everyone knows, it's the moral education that's the most powerful at those ages. So,
Well, especially when it comes to them inserting themselves, like I said about that book earlier, as well, you can't trust your parents. You got to trust us.
Right. So, education, the word education has the same root as seduction. They both mean to lead. One means to lead forth, and one means to lead astray. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing a kind of seducation as opposed to education. And it's frightening to witness. And the more I find out about it, the more disturbing it is. And so I'm working right now on a book about DEI consultancies and the sort of woke industrial complex that's just, as you mentioned, a huge industry right now. And I really want to delve into the psychological effects of the pedagogy that's being pushed right now, and kind of related to my own experiences. So hopefully that book will be out, by the end of the year.
Well, and when you're done with that, please get in contact with me because I'd love to have you come on and talk about it.
Sure.
A thought just kind of occurred to me is that maybe we should fight fire with fire a little bit, and maybe you should look into giving speeches to school boards on behalf of people, since they're going to bring in speakers to push their view, to try to say, this is what happened in my school, and this is how bad it gets. And, I had kids that had anxiety to even be able to question any element of what's going on around them. That story can be told. We can use the same, avenues that they will. And if the only question, I guess, is that, I don't think you're going to get $20,000 for it. And you may even just have to do it during public comment, because in some cases, these places are not going to want to let you talk. Like I've seen, we're pretty lucky where we are. I've seen some school board meetings where there's this guy who keeps yelling at people authoritatively, "You're done." He sounds like an abusive dad talking to these parents, and some of them are they're not yelling. They're not cussing. Some of them are just giving statistics. Like, we're not talking about that. We're not going to bring this up. We've done that. You're done. You're done. And I'm like, oh my goodness. I want to get up from my chair, and show him how done he is and telling me he's done. Because, and it's bad. It's a bullying scenario. And, I think that's part of the point that discourages people. Like, I've had a bunch of people private message me and say, will you please come to this meeting? And because I'm in a wheelchair, it's tough. But they know that if I go to that meeting and they try that crap with me, that they're going to get it thrown right back at them. So it's going to take personalities to step up and do that sort of thing, and so, look into that too. And maybe there's an opportunity for you there. And as much as I don't, I hate making anything for profit, which is the reason I don't monetize my show anymore, because it changes your element, but at least you could be in a scenario where this could help you. The funny thing about Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson is that both of them were just obscure professors at some college somewhere until this nonsense happened. And now it's like that part of Star Wars where Obi-Wan tells Darth Vader, you can strike me down, but I'll become more powerful than you could possibly imagine, because now Jordan Peterson's not just at some college in Ontario saying that stuff. And now Brett Weinstein's not just at Evergreen saying that stuff. They both have enormous YouTube channels and they have an audience, And
what I really want to do is I want to empower parents and students, most of all, to give them tools for how to challenge some of these ideas in the classroom without and outside the classroom without sacrificing, with being smart about it, essentially, without losing your cool, staying calm and collected. And I think, the more students that feel, empowered to step up and voice their concerns with this, I think the better it will be and the healthier it will be for them and the school culture. Because parents, parents are a huge, huge force, but we want to raise students that have a sense of autonomy and a sense of confidence about their own ideas. And I think that's something I'd really like to help with too.
Right. And I think for me, it was just doing what my mom did. My mom was very big on teaching independent critical thinking. For example, I was allowed to question her. I had to be respectful and it had to be the right circumstance. This goes back to, how to raise your kids, but I exposed them to stuff myself. And rather than trying to tell them, how they should react to the things that I was showing them, I'd ask them questions. Generally, if you show them the truth, they put it together, and as a result, now the funny thing is my kids are way more skeptical even than I am, they examine everything. And I think that's what I call it is self-defense for the brain. I exposed them to some, there's a film called Psywar, for example, was made by a friend of mine named Scott Noble, where he explains how propaganda works, how, how public relations work and how advertising works. And now, there are some kids who see a commercial and then they're going to be, in their, the parents' room nagging them to get something, whereas my kids are going to go, yeah, I know what that was about. They're trying to get me to buy something, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's the same thing when it comes to social concepts or, like I was told actually of a situation where my son had gotten in an argument with another student about the issue of police brutality, and he got sent to the principal's office, and the principal's like, well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but he's right, meaning my son was right, go back to class, you know, but in order to develop those kinds of skills to be able to confront those things, or if you don't want your kid to be getting in trouble all the time, you can at least teach them, look, you're going to hear a lot of crap, it's not going to be true. Just do what you got to do to get out of there and get your piece of paper. Even that's a better solution than just not talking to your kids about this at all. Because if you don't, somebody else will be very happy to slide in there and do it for you. It's like don't forget to talk to your kids about drugs or whatever. It's the same concept, and I think that, when it comes to stuff like this, I think we've just been like sleeping on it, because we could trust it for so long.
Yeah.
I think it's time that people are going to have to wake up because, if this has been going on since 2015, and it's just going to get worse, and it ties into so many other things, unless we take a stand. And that was one of the cool things about that Tim Pool conversation was that she was telling a bunch of victory stories. You can take over your school board. These are elected positions for a reason. It's like I tell Black Lives Matter people, I'm like, if you don't like what's going on with your cops, how many of you voted in your sheriff election? And most of them don't even think about it. This is an elected position for a reason. Why don't you put pressure on your mayor to appoint a police chief who's actually friendly to, overcoming, and reforming the police instead of burning down cities? Which one of these things do you think is going to be more? And the funny thing is when I bring that up in those circles, they get quiet and then they don't want to talk about it. I'm like, this is the concept that was set out in front of you. Take control of your school board. Don't just get up and yell. You may even have to run for the position. It's not like being on the school board is like becoming a senator. You'll have to go to some meetings, but it's not going to, it's not going to end your life. But pay attention to those elections. Don't just don't just check marks. Make sure that you know who these people are, because that's really how all this got to happen. Is again, it's like I said earlier, and I don't want to belabor it or beat it to death, but this happened because these are all positions that nobody paid any attention to, and now we're getting the consequences. Now, we've been talking for a while. I wanted to make one more point and get your view on it, but I've been studying a lot about China and how Chairman Mao reaffirmed his power through the Cultural Revolution. And for people who don't know about this, and this is, again, something that's hard to talk about because now people are conditioned to roll their eyes if you bring up anything from Soviet Russia or from China. But the Maoist Cultural Revolution was literally Mao appealed to the students, talked to teachers to get the students to behave this way, set the students against their parents. So like there's literally a scenario where these kids are reporting their parents to the state. And during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of people died, and it was through the education system that this happened. And it was the college-aged kids who primarily were the drivers. And they had this thing they called their Little Red Book, that had all of all the Maoist doctrine in it. And a funny thing is Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, was talking about someone else's socialist book and said, it's like Mao's Little Red Book. Like she was all glowing about it. Like, is this a good thing to you? Like, the funny thing is that even like sensible socialist friends of mine are like, what? Because they don't think he's a good guy. They didn't think Stalin was a good guy. But no, I mean, do you see any parallels to the Cultural Revolution? I mean, we've had Chinese citizens literally just come out and say that that's what it looks like, but that doesn't.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are parents explicitly who have been in the Cultural Revolution have reached out to me and said, I will not put up with this crap because, I lived on one egg a day. So you can't tell me. I watched this happen to my village as a girl or as a young child. This happened, and so they're like the canary in the coal mine. They see, they've been through this. Same thing with immigrants from Venezuela or Cuba, Nicaragua. I mean, this similar things played out, where the capture of institutions with a particular ideology, and the kind of disasters that result from that.
And that's,
You
I
know,
think people,
they're
I
no
would
secret
implore,
to a lot of immigrants, basically,
right. And
who
I would
are.
implore people to study more on it. There's documentaries on it. It's just the kind of stuff. Everybody thought we just defeated this problem. They thought when the Berlin Wall came down that this was all over. And the funny thing is I actually think that some of it, like we're all looking for a puppet master. I think that some of what Yuri was talking about may have already been set in motion by KGB officers who are not even alive anymore. Like
Mhm.
we could be looking at, like, this is like you throw a rock in the pond and the ripples are going out. This could be ripples from during the Cold War. That, so in other words, there may not even be anybody at the reins when it comes to some of it, but the Chinese Cultural Revolution, coupled with the fact that we're having all these problems with China and international politics, kind of slides into place for me.
Mhm.
Because one of the things that's unique about the United States is that our geolocation, our military, it would make it very difficult to just outright invade this country. And as they pointed out, talking about the Soviet bloc countries, the best way to deal with it was just to get everybody on your side, and then they think you're showing up to be their saviors instead of having to fight them.
Mhm.
you know so this has been a fantastic conversation. Please stay in touch, and again, when your book comes out, let us know, and I seriously do hope that you consider looking for these people who need this, like maybe put together
Mhm.
video presentations of your own, stuff like that, to get it out there. Because the thing is that actually, oh, I forgot about this one kind of important thing, is that I've noticed that the strategy now is to say we're not teaching critical race theory. And the reason that they're saying that is because they can instead say, well, no, we're teaching anti-racism.
Right.
And Ibram X. Kendi defends himself by saying, well, I'm not versed in critical race theory. I teach racism, even though he's saying a lot of the same things. Did you encounter any difference between those two things, like when you were dealing with it infiltrating your school?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, there are differences between anti-racism and what's called critical race theory, but they all emerge from the same general, I guess, they're offshoots, right? So kind of, being very specific how this is not that, and what we're teaching isn't really critical race theory because that's something that's taught in law schools, or that whole rhetorical practice is a kind of a smokescreen. So and it's a distraction. I think the way that discourse has played out in the past month or so has been a lot of confusion and a lot of smoke being created. And what I think is most effective to focus on is the pedagogical practices. Make people who are, arguing about the meaning of CRT, make them defend. Do you support asking 8-year-olds to interrogate their whiteness? Do you feel like that is I want to know on record, does Joy Reid support 8-year-olds interrogating and deconstructing their whiteness? Yes or no? If she says yes, well, okay, that's great. I'm perfectly happy that you've made that clear. If you say no, well then okay, good, because that's the problem, right? Don't make it so much about the meaning of the theory or a semantic game. I think it would be a lot more productive to focus on, the divisive practices, and also better from a legal standpoint, because those are the things that are in violation of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act and stuff like that.
It just occurred to me, another example that reminds me of is they want it to be confusing. And it
Yeah.
comes back to the religious persecution thing I was talking about. I once had a conversation with a Muslim girl, and I said, because she said, well, Islam is a religion of peace. And then I asked her about what goes on in the Middle East, and she made a very valid point. She said that unfortunately, what you're talking about, meaning like suicide bombers and terrorists, is that in the Middle East, the clerics are usually the only ones who can even read the Quran,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll just tell you whatever they want you to hear.
Yeah.
And if you argue with them, then you're looking at being, in a lot of trouble, because they murder people over there for getting out
Right.
of control religiously. So she pointed out just that they make it so that they're the only ones who can interpret these things. So if your local cleric is a radical, he's telling you what is true and what isn't, and you're not in a position to argue with him, and you can't read the book yourself. And that just kind of fired in my head that memory, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds
Mm-hmm.
familiar. But yeah, I definitely agree with you. We should empower parents on this, and I hope you continue your work, because maybe you need to look at this as opposed to being something that was like, something seriously negative in your life, is that maybe it's something that reveals your life's purpose. Because I think that's what happened with Brett Weinstein. I think that's what's happened with Jordan Peterson. And the funny thing is Brett Weinstein's a leftist. Like flat out, like he's a left guy. He is not some right-leaning guy at all. And they say that Jordan Peterson is, but he says stuff all the time that's not left, but it's not overpoweringly right either. Like there was a conversation between him and Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein where they all kind of agreed, you need to have a little help. You can't just let capitalism go crazy. Like there needs to be some kind of safety net system to get people when they fall. Like this is even Jordan Peterson saying this, but at this point, if you deviate, then they throw a label on you, and from then on, you're that label, regardless of whether or not it actually suits you or not. So anyway, thanks again.
I will take that advice. I feel like I do feel that way actually, and it's good to hear you say that.
Well, yeah, that's that's kind of what I decided is that maybe these situations and what I can offer to people as far as just trying to clarify things, and especially being able to communicate to both sides was something that I was unique at, but uniquely good at, and then not everybody can do that. But for you, I just say, hey, I hope that you succeed, and don't get discouraged about this. This could literally be something that ends up being an extremely powerful positive force in your life. Because this is the thing that you're in a unique position because you're a teacher. It's not like you're just some guy who read about it on the internet. That's what we always get told. Well, you don't even know what critical race theory is. Oh, okay. Well, explain it to me. Well, you're just some guy on the internet. You need to do the work. I'm like, oh, okay, so explain it to me. And they can't. They know you don't know what it is, but they don't know what it is really necessarily. So anyway, thanks again, Paul.
Thank you, Neil. And if anyone wants to, if anyone wants to email me, I'm at teachingfortruth@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Paul D. Rossi, PAULDROSSI. You can DM me with any questions or problems you may have. I'd be happy to respond.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for coming on. I typically will have a brief phone call with people after a show, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem.
And to all of those of you who are listening, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channels. Again, either if you're right or if you're left, it doesn't matter to me. My main focus is not necessarily to push an agenda as far as, my own beliefs, and so much as to try to clarify things and bring truth to the circumstances of what's really going on. And if there's something that I'm about to say that is more about my own beliefs, I typically tell people, like if I'm about ready to editorialize or something, but what my objective is that I want everybody to start having conversations with people that they don't necessarily agree with. Because at the end of the day, that is something that we're losing, and it's creating divisions that I'm afraid it's not just gonna be about somebody said something mean to me on the internet. It's gonna be somebody hurt me because of my beliefs. And that's already starting to happen, and, we never did talk about harm. What's harm? You said something that it was inappropriate, so now it's harm. And maybe we'll do that another time, but either way, so
you can do a whole show just on harm. Seriously, I have a lot to say about that one.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. And I hope to see you at the next episode of V Radio. Okay.